Okay guys, it's time to get really deep again. Back in the early 1960s, the American literary critic Wayne Clayson Booth wrote a book called The Rhetoric of Fiction. In his book, Booth explores the concept of what we now consider to be an unreliable narrator. Booth's analysis, of course, is limited almost exclusively to the Western literary tradition. His purpose is not necessarily to trace through the history of the unreliable narrator tradition, but rather to analyze it from a theoretical literary perspective. That's the sort of book that you read when you want to read about how great books are written, but you don't want to write a great book yourself. It's not poorly written, of course, but you really have to wonder why somebody would spend so much time reading about books instead of, reading books. Anyway, you can find clear examples of unreliable narrators going all the way back to the classics of classical Greek literature. And when you think about it, it's not really that hard to understand why an author would create a narrator that exists to deceive the reader. Sometimes these narrators exist to force us to look at the world through a perspective we normally would avoid. Sometimes they help us understand things that we could never understand otherwise. Above all, though, it's certainly an old literary technique, and it's one that's employed more widely than you might think. For example, here in Dream of the Red Chamber, we have a sort of divine unreliable narrator. That would be Jinghuan Xiangu, the goddess that Jia Baoyu encounters in Chapter 5 of Dream of the Red Chamber. David Hawkes calls her the Fairy Disenchantment in his translation, The Story of the Stone. And even though I know that it's a translated name, this really is a name that we need to dig into. Now, I'm worried that generations of curious students that have read the English translation of this novel have become confused about this character and what she really represents. So, in the spirit of this project and this YouTube channel, let's dig in and examine the things that most people will skip over. First, let's look at her name one character at a time. Jing, the first character, means to warn or to admonish. Huan, the second character, is one that we've seen before. It means illusion. In other words, this goddess is warning us about illusion. And Shengu means female immortal or goddess. Put it all together and you have the goddess who warns about illusion, or in my translation, the goddess who unveils illusion. That's a lot harder to say than just disenchantment, right? However, there is a reason why that name isn't so fitting. According to the Gospel of Wiktionary, the English verb disenchant has three meanings. The first, to free from illusion or to undeceive, is almost certainly what David Hawkes had in mind. However, the second meaning, to disappoint, is likely more familiar to modern English readers. And if you were a geeky kid like me growing up, you're also familiar with the third meaning, which means to remove an enchantment or a spell from something. We have Magic the Gathering to thank for that. Yeah, and to think that my parents told me I was wasting my time when I played that game during lunch at middle school. Anyway, the problem with the name Disenchantment is that it conjures up a lot of negative meanings, and meanings that clearly deviate from her purpose as a character. She's not trying to disappoint Jia Baoyu, and she's not trying to remove some evil spell that has been placed over him. Her duty, instead, is apparently to warn others of the illusion that is around them. In fact, when she first meets Jia Baoyu in Chapter 5, she literally tells him that this is her job. So when she describes her job to him, she uses this fascinating poem. 私人间之风清月在，掌前世之女怨难施. It means, I govern the karmic debts that come from human passion and rule over the laments of women and obsessions of men. Now, my fellow Chinese language geeks will notice that there's no subject in that poem. Both lines begin with verbs. It's only implied from the context that the goddess is the subject. But you can tell by words like si and chang, both of which here mean to govern, as well as the things that are being governed, passion among humans and the love affairs of mortals. But wait, there's another fascinating thing in this poem. The phrase feng qing yue zhai, or karmic debt that comes from human passion, is a clue to anybody who has been reading Dream of the Red Chamber slowly. Now, yue zhai is kind of a bizarre phrase. It literally means moon debt. I've had to gather from the context that this means karmic debt, and if you read a little bit further on, you'll understand why. Jia Baoyu is really interested in the goddess and decides to follow her around the place that she lives. This is the Taishu Huanjing, or the illusory realm of the Great Void, a name that actually does mean something even though it's not obvious at first. So here we see the famous poem Jia Zuo Jianshi Jian Yi Jia Wu Wei You Chu You Huan Wu, or when falsehood is taken as truth, the truth becomes false, where nothing is claimed to be something, that something becomes nothing, which is one of the most famous cryptic poems in the entire book. But there's something that's even more interesting right around the corner, something that most people miss. Zhao Baoyu comes to a place inscribed with the name Niehai Qingtian. Now, Nie in particular is a Buddhist term, one that refers to evil or sin. Thus, the palace is titled the Sea of Sin and the Sky of Passion. While our favorite Chinese character, Qing, makes yet another appearance here, we probably could call it emotion instead of passion here if we wanted. Now, this does get complicated in a hurry, as we're about to find out. The problem you see is a two-line poem right underneath the title of the palace. The poem reads, Hou di gao tian, shen tan gu jin qing bu jin, chen nan yuan nu, kalian feng yue zhai nan chou, which I translate as large as the earth and as high as heaven, passion through the ages has no end. Obsessed men and infatuated women, it's unfortunately hard to repay the karmic debt of love. Now, let's compare the second line of this poem with the second line of the poem that the goddess used to describe herself. Nu yuan nan shi and shi na yuan nu are the exact same phrase except turned backwards. And we have the return of yue zhai. In the second poem, we're told that this karmic love debt is hard to repay. Okay, if you feel lost, don't feel bad, because Zhao Baoyu was lost as well. In fact, Zhao Baoyu thinks to himself that he really would like to know what the phrases Gu Jin Zhi Qing and Feng Yue Zhi Zhai mean. But he doesn't just want to know what they mean, he wants to ling yue those phrases. So ling yue means to understand in the sense that you've personally experienced them. And then comes the most cryptic passage of all, one that basically says that an evil spirit entered into Zhao Baoyu's heart at this point. So if you look at the Hawkes English translation, it makes really little sense. David Hawkes just calls it demonic lust and leaves it alone. Gladys Young doesn't even try to interpret it. But we're going to interpret it, and it will help make the entire book make a little more sense. Well, first things first, it's not just lust. Zhao Baoyu had plenty of lust before he arrived. No, the key here is that verb that we just looked at, which is ling yue. You see, Zhao Baoyu doesn't just want to know what the women around him are going through, he wants to feel it himself. Doesn't that strike you as sort of creepy? I mean, I'm a guy, and yet I'm still a little bit creeped out by this idea. It's not just that Zhao Baoyu wants to be good friends with you, or soulmates, or a couple, or married, or anything like that. Now, this is like he wants to fish out your deepest and darkest secrets and emotions. He wants to know and feel all of the feelings that you've hidden deep down inside. That is what ling yue means. Now, there's another thing going on in those two phrases that Zhao Baoyu cares so much about. Feng yue zhi zhai, which means karmic love debt, is clearly a direct reference to Lin Daiyu. So remember that Lin Daiyu started out as a flower in the premortal world. Zhao Baoyu was a stone, and magical moss fell off of the back of that stone and onto the flower, allowing the flower to take the form of a human. The flower, who was now the premortal Lin Daiyu, felt so grateful for the magical moss that she resolved to follow the stone, Zhao Baoyu, to earth and repay him with her tears. There are obvious lustful connotations here, but we don't really need to go into them. I'll let you use your imagination. The point here, though, is that Lin Daiyu has created a karmic love bond with Zhao Baoyu, and we're warned in this book that it's extremely hard for her to pay back that karmic debt. But there's another phrase that Zhao Baoyu is wondering about as well. That would be Gu Jin Zhi Qing, the love through the ages, or something like that. I'm pretty certain that this is a direct reference to Shui Baochai, Zhao Baoyu's other love interest. In contrast to Lin Daiyu's wild emotions, Shui Baochai is calm, collected, and unmistakably Confucian. She adheres to tradition and, as we'll soon find out, is marked by her incredible endurance, which is a direct contrast to the hasty and emotional Lin Daiyu. Now, back at the beginning of this video, we talked about a false narrator, so let's jump back into that. Zhao Baoyu sees another poem, one that says, Chun hen chou bei jie zi rou, hua rong yue rong wei xie yan. I translate this as the grief of spring, the woe of autumn, all brought on by oneself, the flower-faced beauties with moonlight grace, for whom are they so beautiful? Now, the key point here is the phrase zi rou, which implies that the flower-faced beauties have brought their sorrow upon themselves. These flower-faced beauties refer to the so-called 12 beauties of Jingling, or the 12 main female characters of the novel. But wait, there's a problem. The problem is that none of them have actually brought sorrow upon themselves. So look at Jingling, for example. She was kidnapped as a very small child and she was trafficked. She did nothing to bring the fate upon herself, and she was fortunate in the end to wind up in the Jia household and not the unfortunate slave of Shui Pan. Speaking of Shui Pan, his sister Shui Baochai is one of the most remarkable characters of the novel with an incredible flair for literature. Shui Pan, meanwhile, is an oaf who only cares about stealing and cheating his way through life. Because Shui Pan murdered a man to get control of Jingling, his family, including Shui Baochai, had to move into the Jia household to go into hiding. Shui Baochai did nothing to deserve this. Her fate is given to her. Lin Daiyu also does nothing to deserve her fate. Her father, Lin Ruhai, has no sons and no way to legally pass along his inheritance, which leaves her at a major disadvantage when it comes to arranging a suitable marriage. In desperation, he has his beloved daughter go live with his late wife's parents. Lin Daiyu is absolutely brilliant, but her brilliance is held back by the oppressive world of the Jia family, a world that she never escapes in the end. Even the minor female characters show signs of this. Li Wan, for example, might be brilliant. We'll never know since her father demanded that she only learn sewing and never learn to enjoy literature. Hua Xiren is largely defined by her relationship with Jia Baoyu, who drives her nuts because he doesn't listen to her practical advice. Her name, even her personality, seems to be largely a product of his wishes and whims, and that's clearly not a fate that she brought onto herself. And I could go on. The point here is that the goddess is actually a false narrator. She supposedly exists to dispel illusion, but I would argue that she actually extends illusion. And you can see it in the name of the place where she lives. Taishu Huanjing, the realm of the illusory void, is an odd name. Taishu means the void, the place of nothingness. Huan, we know, it means illusion. Jing basically means the border, as if she were living in a border area on the verge of absolute nothingness. But the key here really is Huan, which implies that her own existence is also tied with illusion. So remember that poem, 假作真实真以假, 无谓有处有还无, or when falsehood is taken as truth, the truth becomes false, where nothing is claimed to be something, that something becomes nothing. This poem is also a sign that deceit is at the heart of the goddess. After all, what can be more nothing than the void, the place of nothingness? And what could be more false or deceiving than illusion? Anyway, as usual, there's a lot more to say, but we're going to have to go through this one step and one poem at a time. The truth, though, is that none of the girls in Dream of the Red Chamber have done anything to deserve their fates. And the evil that comes into Jia Baoyu's heart is really nothing more than human nature. That is the heart of Cao Shuiqing's criticism of Chinese society, by the way. He's showing that the Buddhist and Confucian principles that his society was based on were completely empty and void. And he shows this in such a deep, fascinating, and complex way. Anyway, more to come.